welcome everybody. I think we're going to get underway. Just a few quick words to explain a little bit what might be going to happen today, which is basically it's a pretty small group of friends who are, as it were, kind of coming in from their respective battlefields to sort of report on what's cooking. So it's a kind of stock-taking event by which we compare notes on what we believe to be the urgencies in our respective work. It doesn't presuppose that any of the speakers are fully in tune with their own work. So it might be, for example, an opportunity for people to speculate on what it is that they might be doing, and in so doing, change what they're doing. And in reverse, those that may feel like they know very well what they're doing may as it were, undo that thought. So it's really about friendship, and therefore it's a kind of meant to be a sort of intimate event with the audience becoming part of that circle of friends. And as you can see from the organization of the conference, it's sort of relentlessly alphabetical in order to communicate the thought that the people who speak as individuals. They're not being kind of clustered into accepted categories or even provisional categories. There's not, the end point of the conference is not a kind of overview or a kind of clarification or even a list of kind of key subjects, but just trying to understand a little bit the vibrations between the respective projects. So then the role of the moderators, of which the first moderator is Mark Jarzombek, who has already begun his theoretical performance, trying to communicate his latest thinking about the urgency of action over words. And in fact, the final result of his labor will be a model of the Sydney Opera House, the geometry of the orange. But the purpose of the moderator is just simply to help the audience get into some sort of dialogue with the three speakers. The moderator is not being asked to, as it were, reveal the secret synergies between these clusters of three. All of the people who are invited are friends because they are, to some extent, unwell, saboteurs. And the sabotage is led by Beatriz, of course, who has managed to violate the alphabetical order, and we flipped Catherine and Beatriz. And in a way, what I like about that is it confirms the fact that it doesn't matter which order in which you speak. That was the whole point. So you could even argue, and that's what a theorist would be bound to do, that only by making a last-minute flip of two of the names do we confirm the fact that the order doesn't matter. So be it. All I will say by way of introduction is, again, just to welcome friends. It means a lot to me personally that we all get together. And of course, the real point of this event is the dinner. And you who are in the audience should feel profoundly excluded from that. And hopefully, if the conference is good, your sense of being excluded from a wonderful dinner should grow during the day, such by the day you feel incredible pain. But I can reassure you that the dinner will be sort of spectacularly uninteresting and devoted to important subjects like Kim Kardashian, these kinds of things. But of course, it's a big part of the world of architectural theory to imagine that you're not present at some sort of key event. And for the people who were at that event to have the sense that actually nothing happened, but in the desires of those that were not there, is constructed an event that becomes actually the event that has a significant impact on the field. So I can't say which aspect of today might have that quality. Indeed, it might not be constructed that way. But the spirit is just out of exchange. So but all I will say of the speakers, who are all amazing, is sort of where they're coming from. So Lucia's coming from Princeton, and Catherine's coming from Pratt, and Mark Cousins is coming from the AA, as if the school in which you teach is the single and most important characteristic of your life, a kind of genetic marker, which at some level must be almost frighteningly true. For those of us who teach, it is sort of frighteningly the case that you are coming from those places. But what it means to teach is, of course, to escape the place that you're in while you're in it. And if the students feel that escape, they get taught, like they feel something happen. And to the extent that the teacher doesn't escape the place in which they teach, you could argue no teaching happens. So I say the names of the places where these people teach with the knowledge that why they are friends and why they've been invited here is they really don't belong in those places where they teach, and they don't like those places even, because liking where you are is probably the beginning of falling under the spell of those places. So I almost, in a very annoying way, say Lucia, Princeton, Catherine, Pratt, Mark, the AA. Anyway, we get underway, firstly with A for Allais. So now Catherine Ingraham.
I can also present from here because I don't have images, or do I have to present? No. I think I'm going to just sit. Well, as usual, Dean Wigley has given us an impossible task of doing everything and then undoing it in the next second. The fact that my name disrupts the alphabetical order gives me a certain adaptive power, I think, where I can actually attempt to not to say just anything, or not to say and then unsay and so on, but just to sort of, I think it's a great idea, actually, the gathering of people from various parts of this. I think Mark has tremendous instinct on this, but it's at the same time, you never do not say something. That's the problem. I think Lucia just gave an exemplary piece of theoretical work in expertly researched and delivered, and so so I want to kind of honor that. I want to say that was really something. That was really something, and it has certain kind of methodology behind it, and it has a certain loyalty to certain things. It has a certain inventiveness, creativity associated with it, and it brings in the material realm, and it gives the material realm certain status, and so on. So all of which is a lot of work and constant parsing of complex material and received ideas. And so, in a way, it's really something to actually put that together in a lucid form. And in a sense, it's connected to everything we always do. It's not a separate line of work, so to speak. Which is to say, what I kind of started, it's a little groping in a sense here, how one goes about addressing this subject at this moment. But it's theory obviously is not one thing or one era. There was a moment I recall when I was at the Charnley House at the SOM Foundation, had this kind of center in Chicago for a while, in which a number of people had gathered to do a certain kind of work, and John Whiteman, who was running that at that moment, called up the stairs to me, who was working on the top floor, and said, "We have to say that you're something, on this program or something. What should we call you?" And I said at that moment that you should call me an architectural theorist. And that was, in one way, a new name, but at the same time, it didn't refer to something brand new, obviously. It meant something fairly specific, but it's incredibly obvious that Vitruvius, and Colin Rowe and Rainer Banham and Bernard Tschumi and hundreds of others, historians and many, many architects have been and have always been and are still theorists, architectural theorists. To locate the specific thing that it meant at a certain moment, which actually I think reflected a certain kind of training more than maybe a particular methodology or something, and resulted in what we would call sort of theoretical discourse. It was interesting that Lucia could call out a moment that was theoretical versus one that was historical versus one that's sort of specifically sort of architectural, possibly, that those kind of distinctions are hard to make, and also are not always standing distinctions. But the specific thing that it defined in a short-term history of architecture, the 80s, 1980s, and 90s specifically, was a common project, an almost common project. There was a sense of commonality to it, to draw out in architectural terms a series of ontological and metaphysical dilemmas that were being articulated, some in philosophy, some in critical theory, some in other domains. And I would say that this is what architecture is always doing, even if the specific orientation, commonality of the project changes with each generation. And so therefore, understanding what this day is about, I like the idea of the friendly day. I don't like the idea of the fact that everybody can't come to dinner particularly, although I understand the logistical problem of that. But it's, in some sense there was a kind of exclusivity to a certain theoretical discourse, and therefore it could be partitioned off in a way that was recognizable and specific, but and socially exclusive at a certain moment in some way that really reflects not on the spirit of that debate, but on the, let's say, the sort of pathology of intellectual work that tries to define its terms in a narrow corridor. And I think that the exclusivity was a big problem, in a sense, for it, and that it had to, it both reveled in it and began to, in some way, that was its downfall. It's what caused it to dissolve as the club or whatever. In any case, I'm not sure, as I say, what today is about. Because my training was in critical theory under the post-structuralists, in a way, it might be about the demise of that era long ago already, a long delayed sort of funeral for that, or it might be a moment in which we're going to bootstrap between then and now, or it might be that we will bring forward a new sort of impetus or a new kind of proposal for the future. In any case, my own work, I'm not going to talk really distinctly about what I'm doing right now, although I've been very interested in the work I'm doing now. It's completely connected to what I was doing then in some form, in some very fundamental form. So it's not new in one sense, and yet in another sense, work is always opening up to its own moment all the time. Mostly it concerns what I call, appropriation, expropriation issues in relation of property to architecture. And I was struck by how the theory of special relativity actually arises at a moment when the dominion over things and the dominion over people begin to refer to each other and begin to and those dominions begin to mix. So one thing that this work on property has allowed me to do, or experimentally, is remove the quotation marks that, let's say, deconstruction put in place around every word almost, so that the word reality had quotation marks around it, the word solid had quotation marks around it, the word foundation had quotation marks around it, architecture had quotation marks around it. And so in a sense, I sort of experimenting with removing the quotation marks from the word reality, and yet it would seem very odd to have pursued a book on property and architecture that did not, to have pursued it merely as a sort of calculability project, a description of calculabilities that we face in our practice and our discipline. And it would have been unheard of, in a sense, to exclude or sequester that from the theoretical frameworks of appropriation that situate these practices in relation to all sorts of other things. We call them history, culture, aesthetics, system of aesthetics, systems of inscription, and so forth. And furthermore, there's nothing more abstract than property. Although post-structural discourse, which had a specific tenure, reached a definite limit. So we can say at the same time that this is a project that, in a sense, has been not really over at any moment, and not requiring, in a certain sense, a sort of apology for its current mention. But nevertheless, there was a kind of moment, I don't know where to identify it exactly, maybe it was the virtual turn, so to speak, when it became claustrophobic and even ugly in both architectural and discursive terms. At the same time, there's no question that it shaped an entire continent of work, in our field that actually segued in a certain way into the digital project and emerges there in a different way. It was the moment, in some sense, that how to define that sort of threshold in a way in an earlier period was just to say that it was a moment when things turned onto themselves for a while in a sort of introversion of analysis. Systems theorized themselves, architecture theorized itself, history historicized itself to result in a kind of historiography in a way that Lucia is really an expert at. And philosophy was also trying to open its own, its own openings to see what could be argued there. And many of these, this doubling back, which was exhausting after a while, is what we now call the turn, is the inevitable turn that if you have done this kind of work, you can see it coming and you sort of dread it in a certain sense. But like all moments when we reflect on automatic or routinized processes, some of which up close are not at all what they appear to be, nor at all how they is related to their performance, but it's related to the deep assumption that they make about something that is governing them. But in any case, when we reflect in that way, we learn things we absolutely need to know. I find it interesting that for the most part, those who were interested in post-structural philosophy and architecture, let's say taking that time, had training not only in architecture, philosophy, history, and critical theory, and so forth, but were avidly interested in psychoanalytic theory. As you know, psychoanalytic theory is now cognitive theory, and it's completely changed its agenda. But many, including myself, in a way you could say sort of the psychoanalysis sort of was just also waning at that moment. But many saw psychoanalysis as this powerful apparatus through which, let's say, relations to objects and subjects was elucidated. It was highly appropriate, I thought, that Mark Cousins recently, a year or so ago, both opened and brilliantly closed the Spectre of Derrida conference in Belgrade. This is 2012. Being in Belgrade was sort of amazing because it sort of mirrored our earlier American and European history. Everyone still smoked, and had these long involved discussions about linguistics and architectural meaning. We were kind of coming in sort of saying, oh my God, I can't believe you're talking about this still. And yet it was also a gathering of friends in the end. It was kind of, it became a way of not visiting in a nostalgic sense because it was so alive to those in Belgrade. It was not a nostalgic subject matter. And it sort of woke us up a little bit and made us write a history of that just for the presentations that turned out to be quite interesting. And not canonical, not setting the canon, not asking for some sort of reconstruction of that or anything else, but actually seeing that's a live discourse in some respects. I mentioned the psychoanalytic here because if Derrida were here, looking at our scene of action today, this room, ourselves, he might well ask why the word theory needs an apology, or why so-called theoretical work is forbidden at some level, and now emerges in a certain sense with the word urgencies in front of it. While we have been fiddling on the computer, so to speak, in our learning curve on that technological front, the repression of theory has been operating, in a sense, on continental philosophy to the point where it is in a state of complete revisionism. So it's not as if it's not as if that our sort of excommunication of theory has, in a certain sense, settled the matter. We went away for a while to work on our computers, and then we come back, not to the same moment, but to some of the some of the same questions, some of the same desires, some of the same forces. But I want to go back just for a second to this, the difficulty, let's say what I call the difficulty of acting within a Derridian form of analysis, which I didn't see at the time, although it was definitely felt at the time. It became for a while, architecture's number one problem. Architecture began to refuse Derrida's project almost immediately, even before it knew how it wanted to proceed, even to the point very early on of ridiculing Derrida's inability to grasp architecture. That's common for us to complain about how nobody gets architecture. It's like so incredibly special. And it is. That's why I discovered this. It is incredibly neat. Although I think we should cease, in a certain sense, characterizing architecture that way as this kind of profoundly misunderstood profession. There is an ongoing truth to it. Peter Eisman frequently remarked on Derrida's conventionality when it came to architecture. For example, Derrida's remarks that benches would be really nice to have in the Parc de la Villette, and why didn't the architects provide these? Why were they spending their time on these other sort of more convoluted projects? Benches here, of course, notate the banal, foregone, humanist gesture that Peter's version of deconstruction was thought. He was imagining he was catching Derrida at his own game, so to speak. Peter, in a sense, never lost sight of the defense of architecture. He stands for architecture's unconscious in some way, and we've internalized some of that, I think, and even now we hear it, we can hear it. Catching Derrida at his own game was both an inside joke, for architects and a warning to architects not to be taken for fools when it came to philosophy. The deconstructivist architecture show at MoMA in 1988, however, mixed up from my point of view, but I was pretty fresh out of a different discipline at that moment. So I had not entered into the sort of Defense of Architecture Act. And I was just sort of saying, what are you talking about? Constructivism has nothing to do with deconstruction and so forth. And even though it's a word game in some way that works, I understand it much better now. But it was a moment of reclamation and redefinition of architectural discipline as it began to digest and negotiate this set of ideas. Most of these ideas, like any ideas, require digestion, translation into what we began to call sort of sardonically, as editing assemblage, the strictly architectural. The strictly architectural was that deep interior fortress of architecture that we feel we know it when we see it. We know when we see an architectural argument. We know when we see an architectural theory. The autonomous language promised to our discipline and practice by modernists, among others, and which we had nurtured like a sacred flame, in a sense, in and through modernity, had also produced this form of self-flattery that acted as an inoculation against such arrivals from outside. We're certainly a discipline and practice that feels itself to be vulnerable to these, anything knives thrown at the artistic and intellectual practices that claim some kind of accountability to reality without quotation marks. I feel the need accordingly to protect the architectural domain from any attempt to expand or involve itself with other disciplines and practices, although, the entire momentum and energy of the discipline depends on that. Our protective impulse has been good in that we have evolved certain tactics for just staying alive and preserving the system, such as, if you won't let me design the whole city, thank you at least for this parking lot project, or if the building is being designed by that large development firm over there, thank you very much for letting me do the cladding over your terrible building. But this impulse has been bad because it periodically, develops in our midst a kind of smallness and narrowness. To speak in another familiar vernacular of architecture, apocalypse and manifestos, I think the narrowness, and many have said this, and I don't mean to start, moralizing in a sense, but we are constantly fighting our own tendency toward disappearance, and it's extremely daunting and difficult to see because we know the power of the discipline to realize aspects of the world that no other discipline can realize. So it's a horrifying spectacle of having the world, in a certain sense, without architecture seems like a kind of foregoing of the depth of the world itself. There are now only, very few critics, a couple of theorists, a handful of architects, and historians and so forth that are willing to take architecture more engaged to actually deal with some of those issues. It's no accident that we still have to rely, in a way, on the vicissitudes of the economy and so forth, sponsorships of all kinds, to actually do this discipline. And it's the various laments about how we are not involved in the designing of credible public space and design of the city, technological and infrastructural innovations and so forth, the recomposition of the models of the environment are all our tasks that we know something about and that should be involved in. There are, however, I think, in a kind of optimistic mode, glimmers of deep experimentation in some of the computational architecture, and we've reached a point where the learning curve is beginning to bend into a more interesting, seems to me, a more interesting direction. So, this is to say, in a way, that architecture is sort of embarrassed by philosophical questions and wishes no one would ask them. Yet these are the questions that motivate any enterprise. Study of the synaptic junctures in the operation of the brain would never be funded or pursued if they did not lead to studies of the mind. In other words, we spend enormous amounts of time and money researching new building techniques and materials, but none of this matters if we have no framework for making those materials and techniques act significantly in one way rather than another. As has often been said by many, there's no other need for architecture than its ability to go beyond the material assembly itself. Builders and developers can do everything except that. But one more kind of return to Derrida to recoup for a second of something about the hyper-productivity of that method, and again to sort of revisit the difficulty. I'm not now arguing that as a sort of way to go. I'm not going to give any recommendations for method of inquiry. But the hyperproductivity of that method had to do, and part of this was its paralysis and also its incredible fertility, was how each veil pulled back revealed another world. It was precisely this work that architecture found compelling, but in a certain sense impossible. One could summarize this impossibility by saying it took too much time. Architect could not develop architectural ideas, deal with the 5 constituencies you have to deal with, find the money, and at the same time go through a kind of Derridian analysis of the project. It was powerful of a theoretical mode of inquiry because it refused to close. It was not a system. It was not a system at all. It wasn't an autopoietic system. It was not a system, but an interrogation of the very presumptions of systems. One needed here an unrelenting rigor in patiently peeling back the logic of structures, not in order to turn the page on them, not to eliminate them, but to view them in a different way. Such tactics in architecture promise to reveal the forms and claims of cities, buildings, disciplines, practices, historical claims, linguistic assumptions, and so forth. The misprision of its purposes, one of which was that it was kind of a form of destruction. It was a form of attack in a sense, but it wasn't interested in destroying. It wasn't interested in turning the page on. It was interested in staying within and allowing a certain sort of analytic critique to take place. This was also its arrogance, as many had noted, but it's undeniable that Derrida's work in particular was incredibly creative. This moment was, I believe, what I would call the first generation of a contemporary, enunciated, immensely important, new intellectual dimension to architecture. The next generation is open. It's not clear how this evolves or what it evolves through, but it's clearly, I think, going to belong to certain kind of scientific investigations into neurologics and biologics, which has already happened to some degree in a certain turning of historiography toward a kind of biohistoriography or recovery of Foucault in some sense. The prevarication further that Derrida involved in, the prevarication and delay that displace time and space, that constitutes meaning, repaid in some way the labor and patience involved in the analysis. And yet we, those who were trying to be alert to this new form of surgical analysis, grew more and more tired, secretly wishing for an end to the interminable task of laying everything bare. Derrida's provocations, often coupled with Deleuze, of course, and many others, were a heyday, as mentioned earlier, for tectonic metaphors. Architecture seemed to underlie everything, and was everywhere consequential. We were, as we had so often wished to be, the discipline. When deconstruction arrived at a synthetic moment, the building a practice, its impulse was to start a new line of critique, which was the last thing that could be afforded at that moment. The pathos of this, to use Colin Rowe's word, the pathos of the reconciliation between the ideal and the contingent, the all the time in the world to no time in the world whatsoever, the deadline, the requirement that somehow we settle, that we build, is that we always failed to do what we thought was going to be possible. And the complex narrative of creation became the impoverished yet poetic narrative of lament. Architecture as an discipline is fragile, in other words, yet capable of virtuoso action. We're well aware of that. I think that my own work has registered much of this sort of spirit of engagement and then settlement, whether it's a kind of falling away or whether it's pathos in that sort of sense of a kind of sentimental settlement of some sort. It's certainly, all theoretical work is prone to that. Partly because it feels itself to have been cheated of its proper conclusion. The ecstasy of the late 20th century discussions on architecture that many of us were involved in, for those of us who were involved in it, was caused by this tremendous tension, I think, between language and the hardness of things. This was not a contest between language and visuality, as was often thought, but the immersion of the confidence of vision in the shifting domain of meaning. So our contribution, in a sense, to the philosophical discussion had to do with the detailing of the visual in such a way that we could put it in question. We also found, in a certain sense, form in kind of an enigma, enigmatic diagrams that have only carried through sort of digital work, where we are producing still enigmatic architectures that we have to go in at the last minute and rescue for a kind of architectural production. So in a certain sense, I think what Lucia said about a certain continuity between what happened in the late 90s and what's happening now is to be looked at, that there's that the process studio gave way to the virtual studio, that the paperless studios that Bernard landed on the 5th floor of this building actually were coming out of the process studios that were happening on the lower floors. So, by way of a kind of maybe a concluding section to this, without and wanting to conclude in some meaningful way, but but also resisting conclusion for obvious reasons. I think that theory is crucial. Always, it's always crucial. It's not only to be desired, but it's underway everywhere we look. One of the Santa Fe Institute scientists, John Holland, writing on complex adaptive systems, likens theory to a vaccine, which leverages the immune system into learning about the disease, saving the costly production of learning about the disease online, so to speak. Without theory, he says, we make endless forays into uncharted lands. Theory is never opposed to practice, in other words. A rehearsal of practice. It's practice itself. It's a practice itself, and it engages with a practice that rehearses its theory. It's very evident when a discipline, architecture in our case, is not feeling hospitable, when it does not want to talk about itself to others, as has been the case for some time. Language, Homi Bhabha says, is hospitality after all. Many felt that the post-structural debates were exclusive, as I said, but again, we shouldn't confuse the debates with the sort of politics of the debates. Some recent discussions display, again, a parsimonious closure of architecture to the hospitality of discussion, a fatal loss of energy and knowledge in systemic terms. And this is signaled by a kind of desperation at not having, for every theory, an architectural style immediately to hand. Those strange, cartoonish, decayed and failed buildings, in a sense, were one such instance of having to fabricate, in a certain sense, the architecture of deconstruction, rather than understand and being more, again, being faced with a deadline in a sense, and having to hunker down or knuckle down to get a architectural form out of what was was turning continuously into self-reflective discourse. What one would hope for is a willingness to risk certain dissolutions, or at least an opening of our self-made borders, in order to participate in the incredible, even earth-shattering rethinking of forces that directly concern us, the dramatic, forces and changes of our environment, institutional restructurings, and so forth. Perhaps I've spent too much time so far complaining about architecture's resistance to theory, but I have asked myself on occasion if I personally really wanted architecture to become genuinely Derridian, whatever that might have meant. That was what my PhD was in, the genuinely Derridian. The very reason I had fled to architecture from critical theory and comparative literature was not to be held hostage by my training. And yet there is never a total escape. Had I fled my discipline in order to colonize it elsewhere on behalf of those theories whose warmest hospitality I had deliberately rejected? I feel the true answer to this question is my almost entire grasp of post-structural theory did not coalesce until I had to put it to work in the field of architecture. The question, what does this theory have to do with architecture, was the galvanizing, wholly skeptical moment from which architectural theory slowly emerged for me. I was thus led to believe that architecture's resistance was absolutely necessary to this formation, but the question, but I also discovered that architecture knew something extremely important that philosophy did not know. And I think the question, while different, is also the same now, but it has to do more and more urgently, I would say, with what it is important for us to know now. Derrida was a painful presence then, and he's a painful presence now. He was celebrated and vilified, his belief in the diagnostics of language. In fact, I mentioned the word language at GSD last week, and there was a kind of immediate repulsive response, a repulsion of it, as in architecture is not language. And that codification of that pair is so still very, very powerful. I actually wasn't thinking in terms of written or spoken language. I was thinking in terms of another use of it, more general, but it's still incendiary. And yet, I think that what Derrida did was immensely fruitful, immensely creative, as I've said, and it also went to work, and it hasn't stopped working. He himself, of course, was a very calm man in a certain way, who wrote in the morning in his pajamas, and nothing lay outside his interest, which was unbelievable spread. At stake was not the language game in the end, neither mine nor Derrida's nor anyone else's. What was at stake for him, as he enunciated later, Jeff Kipnis sort of debunks this moment, and you can think about whether it's debunkable or not, but when he says what is at stake is holding our, I think these are his words, holding on to our freedom in relation to received ideas, wherever they may occur. Freedom is a scary word. It's not a clean word. And it doesn't mean the same thing now as it meant then. And then we understood freedom. We were attracted by the idea of a freedom from received ideas because we thought it meant the same as the modernist use of the word freedom, which was a freedom from historical kind of certitudes and historical dead ends and historical thinning out. And so we saw it as a liberation. But freedom doesn't mean that anymore. We know that partly because we're implicated in a system that makes it hard to stand outside and be critical of it, but also because we are now hyper aware of, in a certain sense, brand new identities having to do with biological and immunological relationships to ourselves, and a sort of system of that which it defines freedom in terms of an autonomy that is not a release, but is a perpetual sort of posing and recomposing the borders of that identity in order to admit into it new energy and knowledge, but also to keep it organizationally somehow cohesive. And that sort of autonomy is a very different kind of freedom. Thank you.
And now the very lovable Mark Cousins, who comes to us from the front row.
Okay, maybe I'm the one today who actually still teaches theory at an undergraduate level. Everyone else has become so kind of august and professorial and deanish. And so some of my remarks are really going to be drawn from that experience and in a sense directed towards it. I've tried very hard in the last few years at the AA to completely reformulate what we mean by teaching architectural history. And we no longer teach architectural history in its traditional form, especially when personified in the form of a kind of long course or series of courses, and to rather take as the object of our study what I would call the architectural past, by which I mean something radically different from what you find in like those long kind of what used to be penguin histories of art and architecture and all the varying versions of them that appear now, which kind of feels to me like almost like the CV of architecture, or the CV of a very few members of the collection architecture. In a sense, what we're concerned with is to try to look at the way in which the past of architecture is constructed as a set of historiographical entities, and how people, including architects, directly relate to the architecture of the past in a way which historians normally exclude. So to a historian, how Korb responded to the Parthenon isn't itself a form of architectural history, and yet that seems to me quite strange. In a sense, the architectural part is the bit that architecture doesn't tell of itself as a narrative. Perhaps it doesn't want to kind of tell it all. In any case, you're all aware of the experience, even if you're relatively truthful, that when you look at the CV that you've put together when you apply for a job, there's no one in this room who can help feeling that's not me at all. And indeed, you're right, it isn't. Who it is, they'll gradually find out. Okay, so imagine in a sense you're teaching something which still at the AA is labeled theory. I mean, I hope we can change this. I think it should probably be called drawing. The student is kind of inducted into, I don't know what I'd call a sort of rigid ignorance. And so it's a very interesting population to teach because they have a position which they won't move from, but which we would call ignorance. I mean, they are as far as possible from the sort of enlightened ideal that they will come to you having despaired of their ignorance. And so I want to look towards the end of what I say, and could I borrow a watch? That's the closest I've ever come to showing a slide. I'll go through some of their eternal verities, which makes teaching quite difficult. But I'd like to put what Catherine very kind of eloquently and very logically, theoretically, consistent account, together with some issues which are infinitely more practical in the formation of their theoretical view. One of the things our system of education does to them is to persuade them almost as to the point where we don't notice it ourselves, that the so-called theory we teach is almost exclusively a theory about design. Right? Most of what passes for the name of theory takes as axiomatic that what everything is about is designing. That what's taken as axiomatic is that the student stands in the place of whoever is about to design. And of course, this intellectual position, expressed as theory, is one which is replicated in the unit. There, for 5 years, the students are welcomed and indeed compelled to occupy the position of the little prince and the little princess, the designer with my project. Right? And at that level of formation, allow nothing about constraints to creep in, except as part of the horrors of the real world. But don't worry too much, because you're a student of the AA, so you might not have to explore it. And so, however abused and full of complaints that they're working too hard, etc., I mean, the role of these powerful positions, of course, in architecture schools, I mean, starts, I think, from the most pathological one of all. Why are they open at night? I mean, how did all schools around the whole world? I mean, it's almost, it feels like, you know, in a post-structuralist relativist term, you know, when people say, well, just show me one universal. Yes, all architecture schools are always open at night. I know it's not a big beginning, but there we, you know, there we are. That is now the fundamental statement of Cartesianism. The school is open, therefore I am. It's remarkable. And they each have quite often different accounts of why the school does. This bears on the question of how architecture students incorporate the universal. In Bangkok, It's open all night. Their reason is that at 10 o'clock every night a ghost story is read on the radio. And by 10:30 when it finishes, everyone is so frightened in the studio that they can't go home anyway. And so the universality of this position of the designer is perhaps one of the most fundamental positions which we enforce through our teaching. And in a sense, this for design, on the one hand, seems to provide theory with a legitimacy which, as Catherine expressed, is its absolute proximity to architecture as such, as theorists used to call it. I mean, it was, as such, was the architect's kind of alternative to the thing in itself. Now, I think this introduces a real problem, because then theory, and I notice this, in undergraduate theories, they unconsciously or without thinking, the same thing, I mean, that not being quite the same thing, refer spontaneously almost to philosophy. If someone says, what's theory? And you say, well, I don't know, it's having sentences with abstract nouns in them. And they say, you mean it's like philosophy? And you say, yes, that'll do, fine. Now, the problem is that if you look at philosophy students, whom I notice are usually extraordinarily boring, they're never told in a class, but they know that philosophy is to do with higher things. And they know that higher things are to do with things of greater abstraction. And so, it somehow, you have to kind of raise your head to it. It indeed perhaps has a direct parallel in architecture with sort of towers and high buildings and high places. I think actually acrophobia is not the same as vertigo. I think acrophobia is a fear of tall buildings, as opposed to vertigo. The reason, of course, for anyone to be bothered with the distinction is that in vertigo, when he's first referring to his symptom, he refers to acrophobia, although the title of the film is obviously vertigo. It's somehow in that second scene, so architectural in itself, when he comes in and taps the brazier that she's been painting, and he says, "What's this doohickey?" She says, "You know about that. You're grown up now." Unfortunately, he isn't. I suppose because he studied at Princeton. This upward take infects theory at a sort of unargued, because it's like above the level of argument. So theory then also becomes something like an abstraction. No one ever gives the distinction, the abstract to the concrete, an architectural kind of reading. The concrete, I mean, you know, if you're talking to Hegel and say, you know, where do you get your concrete? Or how do you pour your concrete? Now, in fact, it seems to me that one of the things you have to teach, if one wants theory to be able to engage with architecture, is that it requires exactly the opposite, and I mean this literally, point of view, that it is a kind of downward glance. It is not a reaching for concepts of higher and higher abstraction, which by themselves then philosophically are supposed to be stronger and stronger, more capable of causal explanation, more capable of epistemological appropriation, more capable of truthful classification. It's the opposite. Theory, and by theory here I mean a theory of a particular, I was going to say region, but somehow the word region has become very problematic these days. Actually, I think for a very architectural reason. I mean, region used to be used essentially in the 70s as a sort of super rigorous theory of somewhere in society, but I'm not quite sure what the best way of putting it is. So we'll call it a regional truth or whatever, a regional aspect. But regional has become very, very complicated, especially architecturally. I can best summarize the thing by the fact that I went to the first Sengen architectural biennale, and a lot of young architects were concerned to show me that they didn't want to do these huge big projects, but they really wanted to work on smaller projects. And one of them grabbed me and said, you know, he was interested in doing small projects using local materials and using knowledge, although his, you know, basic vocabulary was that of modernism, and my eyes were clouding over. But I listened to him, and so he shows me this photograph of a critical regional project. And I suddenly realized, have you noticed that photos of critical regional projects always take place the other side of a river? There's always a river between you and the critical regional project. It's most extraordinary. Anyway, this was a kind of two-story apartment block with a lot of wood. I don't know whether that made it regional or critical, but anyway. The point was, I was struck because I was thinking to myself, I saw a critical regional project in Spain that looked exactly like that. And then it dawned on me, as it were, this would be the philosophical way of looking at things, that actually there's somewhere in the world called region, and I've never been there. And that's where they make this stuff. But they sort of export some of it. And I mean, all these trips that everyone goes, why someone doesn't just take a unit trip to region? You know, you can get unbelievably cheap fares these days. Why don't we, we're not compelled to give people sort of, degrees in philosophy. We should actually kind of make these terms suffer, rather than allow them to be pompously repeated. And the cost to the student is very high, because the cost to the student is always time. And the one thing a teacher can do for a student is save them some time. It means that the student doesn't have to go all through the stuff that it took you so long to get rid of. It's not about, it's not all these like myths of Faustus or something, 30 years. You don't accumulate nonsense. I mean, you don't accumulate knowledge. You just get rid of nonsense. And once you realize that, then saving time. And that means an awful lot of writing in architecture should not be taken seriously. Here's the university demanding that you write many articles a year. I love the way they say peer-reviewed. I mean, as if that would make it better. An extraordinary idea. The fact that there's 5 idiots prepared to read your article for absolutely nothing and then write about it, saying, I found this quite interesting. I mean, what kind of a person would do that? Okay, now I wanted to try and elucidate. I set myself the task of just thinking, like in the seminars, after the lecture, theory, what are the central architectural beliefs that you have to confront? And this shows why sometimes architectural teachers are a little suffused by anguish. The major axiom is that central to all things is the house. The house is the center of architecture. The house is the center of everything. When you try and say no, I mean, like, the house is the sort of black hole of architecture. It's like the black hole of theory. It's the next proposition, if you just thought, it couldn't get worse, it's getting worse. The house is really about memory. Whatever is going to happen in the next generation, theoretically, its slogan should be, forget memory. I mean, I was taught by Frances Yates, and she would certainly. She was wonderful and deeply malicious, and if anyone had a story against Jung, she'd love to hear it. So I think we should have the art of forgetting. I suppose each age has its kind of sanctimonious sentimentality. And we haven't improved on that. I don't mean there aren't things that should be remembered, and there aren't things that shouldn't even be memorialized. But somehow we have brought to it a kind of excessive celebration of, it's not even melancholia. It's a sort of Disneyfied grief. I haven't been to it, but I'm told if you go into the Holocaust Museum in Washington, you're actually given a ticket so that you can, follow around some dead human being to watch their fate develop, as is sort of archivally certified. Then when you come out, there's an enormous pile of people who've just thrown the ticket away. So, it's grief, but it doesn't last an awful long time. So you've got, like, the first year, want to talk about memory. The next one seems to me a really perverse one. It's being reminded that seeing is a form of touching. I mean, it's not that I'm kind of disputing some of the historical kind of claims about that. It's not that analytically I'm not aware of the proximity of visuality to tactility. It's not that. It's like, why has it become... It feels to me a sort of... It's kind of leaking out of a sort of Canadian phenomenology. It's got to do with something. Maybe people who have big mountains, like tell you, seeing is touching. And of course, what never goes away is what is meaning in architecture. I mean, people are really intense in their wish to persecute architecture. People don't walk up to other things in life and say, yeah, but what does it actually mean? It reminds me of my grandfather, who hated me. Thank you very much. And I had a collection of postcards of illustrations from Picasso, and he says, well, what's that then? And then he'd take it, and he basically thought that what Picasso was rather like actually a competition that existed in newspapers, called things like everyday objects photographed from unusual positions. As though somehow if you looked at it, like, I see what it is. It's, I don't know, a television seen through a tea strainer, or whatever. I don't know where these certitudes, like, in a sense, come from. And the current one is, yes, architecture threatens human rights. Although there's some people in the audience who say, actually, architecture should be able to save human rights. Well, it's one of those things, that both sound to me not very like those. So you're confronted teaching this stuff, and I suppose at a certain level, in the struggle, there comes out some kind of outcome. But what I've become convinced is that in a sense, philosophy and architectural theory, if we are going to prove things, are diametrically opposed. The task, in a sense, of architectural theory is to get philosophy off the back of architecture. I mean, leaving aside the discussion of the deconstructive exhibition, I mean, it would be fine, it seems to me, to, in a very modest classroom fashion, take something like a window. I mean, I think of the windows in the lecture hall at the AA, and simply ask the seminar group to try to analyze what aspect of the window belongs to architecture and what aspect of the window belongs to philosophy. I mean, you know, I mean, that is perhaps to over-formalize it. And of course, behind it lies something even more kind of low level. In a sense, what theory does, or should do perhaps, is to be able to provide people with the capacity to make a description. Normally, of course, in philosophy, description is the low-level singular instance. And whatever it's called, theory, the generalization, the concept, whatever, is at the opposite end of the scale. I think we ought to think in architecture that, in a sense, there is no higher than the lowest of all, which is the description. Around the question of the description, all architects could agree that one of the interesting things about architecture is there has never been a language in which we can all equally share to describe a building. I mean, when we describe a building in words, we conventionally use some terms which are conversational, doors, windows, some aspects of a description drawn from, say, tectonics, some from very specialized languages, like that of certain elements of Gothic detailing. We don't have, in that sense, any simple formalist suite in which we can produce a description of architecture. The move towards the description, then, is the highest, lowest thing, perhaps, that architectural theory should be doing, and it should be removing the obstacles to description. The students, and probably faculty at Harvard, who laughed when you said language, should really think again. After all, one thing we know about architects, when asked, what is it they do most of, the answer is talking. Thank you very much.
So I think we can do about 15 minutes of conversation before we'll just continue immediately with the next panel. you would start with the word drawing.
Well, because I think, one of the dumb things that happened when the digital arrived was you got these kind of defenders of drawing, or you got a lot of what you might call in other terms, kind of quite conservative people saying, we're losing drawing. I'm not quite sure what losing drawing means, because then they would go on and describe the functions of drawing in so very wide an extent that if you lost them all, the place couldn't function. I think there was a problem in a sense of many of those secondary functions or less obvious functions of drawing were initially scattered and weren't quite sure what their address was any longer. I think that there's a kind of, if you take that together with the fact that no one wants to use the term representation any longer, then there's a role for an arena within an architectural education that you might call graphic signification. Now, first of all, that would permit a genuine commerce between our physical understandings of letters, writing, in a way which joins it to a history of drawing. Histories of drawing seem to me remarkable to leave out writing, as they do often. And I think that there's a whole area there which is usefully kind of put together. So I also kind of feel it's kind of honest in an obscure way, that if you called it that, people would quite like it, and it would stay that way for a bit.
I have a question for Lucia. You introduced the question of constructive public. Could you talk a little bit, perhaps, cut that out of the talk and talk about how something this facades sort of types of public relationships to sort of architecture memory? Too late.
Specifically memory?
No, I'm thinking about, you're the only one who addressed or tried to of the public as something that is sort of outside and is produced in a particular way to understand a certain type of art. So that, of course, still exists today, but even though it's hardly able to imagine, talk about it, imagine. So is there a crisis of that? What's going the other way? In your sort of gut subtext of your argument.
Right, for architecture, not for theory.
Well, I'm just asking personally, so to speak. For you, what's driving this interest, and of course you can wave in as many leads of architecture and theory as you want.
There's an assumption that as soon as you speak of historical architecture, the public grows. That there's a larger public for historic or preserved, or that preservation is what happens when the public gets larger and gets involved. And so I was trying to tell a story where that enlargement occurred through very calibrated exchange between very highly rarefied individuals using very specific technologies, and then grain by grain, building those technologies into the stone so that it would look like it had a kind of memorial abstraction to the rest of the world. And I don't think that that's any different today. I mean, I spoke about the specific typewriter and the specific, sketch drawn by the specific guy who's in charge of the Loeb collection. But essentially, it seems to me that the notion that architecture needs no translation, which is why places like UNESCO attempt to build a public through architecture, is something that's very it's a sleight of hand that has been constructed out of very specific technologies which are highly rarefied. So, and that includes, being the editorial page editor of the New York Times. Being the editorial page editor of the New York Times does not preclude being part of a very rarefied group who will then, and the other point that I wanted to make is that the assumption that this will kill that, which also is always that the public helps us remember, architecture needs the public because otherwise architecture will be dematerialized or it will be killed by other media. I was trying to show a chain of events where it went typewriter to stone to book to another typewriter, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, I'm trying to show that the public is not a monolithic thing, but made out of the same substances as everything else.
Then I have a question for Catherine. On the Uranium post-Uranium world that you sort of map out, how does that translate for you, not so much into your own work, but into something of pedagogy? I mean, is there a pedagogical world here that is there that we didn't talk about, or is it we just focus on sort of our own readings and interpretation?
Do you mean what gets taught now? I mean, is it sort of Mark's discussion in a way of what gets taught now and how does it get taught and so forth? I guess, yes, I mean, of course, different things get taught, different eras. There's curriculum, there's kind of curricula, and there's various sorts of mechanisms that guide the differences in those operations. And I think that, at the same time, when you're a faculty member that has continued through a number of different eras, obviously, it's interesting in a way. It's a kind of, at the same time that certain things move to the center of pedagogical focus, other things move to the edge for a while and so forth, but that in some way it's why pedagogy has to be supplemented often with a kind of another body of work, I would say, is that the body of work that you parallel pedagogy with doesn't mean you're teaching your work all the time, or that somehow the additional work you're doing, whatever it is, it's whether it's just thinking work or some kind of ongoing commitment to a sort of, kind of writing or kind of research, that is important for the way in which you develop as a teacher. You don't just develop in the classroom, and the curriculum doesn't just somehow flow out of you as a result of that development. You actually need a sort of parallel development, I think, in order to stay in a pedagogical modality that has any meaning in a way. So curricula are very important, but what's more important is kind of what and how things are taught, and they're not the same thing. And the structure in which that takes place is sometimes benevolent to those interests, and other times not. But in a funny way, the classroom is a sort of private theater of the enactment of a set of relationships between student and faculty and so forth. So and that parallel work actually is informing that, but it's not. It also is a way for a pedagogical relationship to grow rather than to remain static. But that's kind of pontifical. I don't know. It just if you're talking about the sort of teaching of theory, I would say, again, it makes, I mean, I thought the saving time thing was really excellent that Mark said, that actually you can save people, you can save practice a lot of time by teaching theory. That, you know, that your practice doesn't have to go through every possible scenario or every possible experiment in order to discover, you know, how certain things can be done, and so it's and certain kind of theoretical management is really extremely helpful. But yeah, there are many different kinds of, yeah, it's too general. I'm not sure if that, yeah.
I'm just going to add to, I mean, funnily enough, at the AA, at least one aspect of this kind of seems to happen almost overnight. And it's partly because the space of the library is far too small for the books we have. So you're only getting a kind of what the library staff think is going to be needed, like the next term. And I can remember very vividly that, you know, there was one term where every kind of bookshelf was groaning with Derrida, someone on Derrida, someone against Derrida. And you came back after the summer holiday, God damn it, they've all gone. And they're replaced with books which seem to be covered in pictures of fish. So you say, how was this? And someone said, complexity. So, you know, somehow the library had kind of got, well, I think it was that Charles Jenks had put on a conference on complexity. It's not a topic he's terribly suited to. So there it was. They were all interested in there's an institute for, not for fish, no, it's for very complicated things. It's somewhere in, I don't know where it is in this house, Los Alamos or something, no. Santa Fe, that's it. They do really complicated stuff there.
Santa Fe Institute.
Of complicated stuff.